This is training number 6. And what we are going to talk about with this is obviously what's generalization and what's maintenance. And we're going to talk about some of the strategies that are used to help promote those things. So we've talked and we've mentioned the word generalization a couple of times in here. Does anybody have a good idea of what that really means? What do you think? Generalization. Go ahead.
Being able to do something over multiple people in multiple environments.
Okay.
So if you can say mama, you can say mama for her, and for him.
Mm-hmm. So you want to be able to teach something that somebody's going to be able to use, right? And if you can only do it under certain conditions, it's not as useful as if you can do it when you're supposed to be able to do it all the time. So generalization is something that we focus on to make sure that when we're training things, because remember, we're manipulating little bits and pieces. We're changing one variable to get a change, and it's very experimental and systematic. But sometimes we don't want that one change to happen with just that one variable. We want that change to happen across multiple variables. But we also want that change to happen only on the variables that we want it to happen for, not more generalization than we actually want either. So it's this balance of getting enough but not too much. So the things that we're looking to do is making sure that when we teach skills or when we set up a treatment plan, those things then also happen in the natural environment, and also that they maintain across time. So the difference between generalization and maintenance is generalization is getting the same skill or the same behavior to happen across people, places, and things, and maintenance is getting that same thing to happen across time. So we want them to be able to, like what I was talking about with the language, when you learn a language, you want to be able to maintain that language. That would be maintenance. You want to be able to use it even when you're an adult if you learned it when you were a child. If it was generalization, you would want to be able to learn something here, like let's say I took a foreign language class and I took how to speak Italian, and then I went to Italy, and I want to make sure that the same Italian that I learned here is then going to work in Italy. So there's problems with that sometimes, like there's differences in dialect and things like that. So if I want generalization to occur, I need to actually know a little bit about what the environment is that I want it to occur in. And those kinds of things, there are some strategies that you can do to make those things more similar, so that way when you do get into the environment when you're supposed to use it, that the behavior actually happens the way that it's supposed to. So here's an example of generalization. And remember, when we begin learning about a new concept, we're just trying to understand it. So think about this from an understanding approach. So a baby picks up a flower, puts it to his nose, and smells it. The mom approaches and says, "Oh, good boy, did you get that for mama?" So this happens a lot, right? Little kids do fun little quirky things that they see other people do. And then a few minutes later, the boy picks up a stick and he puts it to his nose and he smells it. And that would be an example of generalizing that behavior. Now, was it accurate? It was a stick. It wasn't a flower. It was kind of cute, but it's not exactly the way that it's supposed to be done. So was that response generalized?
No. Oh, well.
It was generalized because he did it in a different way with a different thing.
Oh,
Okay, so why do you think that response was generalized? Kind of. So you've got two things that are the same in certain ways. How are they the same? Okay, so the response was the same. How about the stimuli? Why do you think he generalized that particular response with those two stimuli? You guys know what a stimuli is? Stimuli is anything in the environment. It's a chair, it's a stick, it's a person, those kinds of things. So the two stimuli that he had were the stick and the flower. Why do you think he generalized that same response between the flower and the stick?
They're similar in looking, I guess, that long and thin.
They're long and thin. They're outside. He probably picked them both up off the ground, right? So there are some similarities, but there are some things that over time you learn that there are things that belong to different classes. So over time, people respond differently, so that might be really cute. Like she might go, "Oh," and she might smell it, and then he might be more apt to pick up other things off the ground and do that, but at some point somebody's going to be like, "That's a stick. I don't want to smell a stick." You know, somebody's going to give him a negative response, And then he's gonna learn, oh, I get a really good response when I do it with the flower, but not so good when I do it with the stick. And that's kind of how you learn through trial and error. And you learn that some things are similar enough where you should do the same responses with those things that you did with these other things that are kind of similar, but sometimes they're different enough that you need to have a different response to do with that. So, and we really learn that by that trial and error kind of approach. We see something, we try it, we generalize it until it doesn't work anymore, and then we stop generalize it, and then we categorize it into something. Does that make sense? Okay, so the definition of generalization is the ability to perform the behavior across different settings. So this would be considered setting generalization. If I generalize from one place to another, that would be setting generalization. Can somebody give me an example of what they think setting generalization is?
At home versus at school versus at therapy.
Yep, so I teach them something at home, and then they produce that same response in the school environment. Simple, right? How about across different stimuli for stimulus generalization? Give me an example of that.
Stick and flower.
The stick and the flower, that's a stimulus generalization. Good. How about across different response topographies? What's a topography? What it looks like. So what would be a generalized response?
Be saying thank you to your mom if she get me something, or saying thank you to somebody else.
So that would be across people.
Like spelling a different flower?
That would be generalization of stimuli. So it's generalized response. Smelling.
Like getting the response from the flower, but not from the stick?
Getting a response from the parent, like the mom might say.
Hold on, let me give you the answer. Okay. So when you do two similar responses, so like let's say when somebody says, "How are you today?" and you say, "I'm fine," or you can say, "I'm having a pretty good day." They both mean the same thing, but they're two responses that you give under the same conditions. So that would be a generalized response, like you're kind of doing something similar to the same condition. You have more than one response that gets you the same thing. I can ask you what I want, like I can say, "Can I have juice, please?" Or I can say, "Get me the juice, I need it now." Those both get me the same kind of thing. So the response is a little bit different. Okay. Here are some very specific generalization or definitions to these, which setting generalization you guys got, that's pretty easy. You can also generalize not just the space specifically, but time, like setting could be morning, evening, different days a week. That could also be parts of setting. Stimulus generalization, I think you guys had a pretty good understanding of that, but it could also be pictures, it could be, different kinds of stimuli, it could be tone, it could be other kinds of stimuli. Stimuli doesn't necessarily just have to be the one thing, like it could be a light. Response generalization, so responding in a variety of ways, making a complex request or drawing different kinds of faces, those kinds of things would all be examples of response generalization. If I say draw a face and you draw a smiley face, and then I say draw a face and you draw a sad face, that's response generalization as well. All right, so these are some of the strategies that we're going to talk about as we go forward for generalization. We're going to start with natural environment training. And basically, here's an example of that, and then we'll kind of go back and talk about it. But when teaching a child to manipulate fasteners, then you might you teach them the skill when they're getting dressed with the clothes that they're naturally putting on. So natural environment training was one of those things that we had under the big umbrella, right? And basically what you're doing with that is the stimuli and the reinforcers are either the same or as closely matched as possible as the ones that you're going to use in the natural environment during the training session. So we do this a lot with ADLs. We do this a lot with classroom kinds of materials. So let's say you were going to teach a child to increase their vocabulary of receptive instructions. and you wanted them to perform those things in the school setting, but you were going to teach them in the home. What kinds of instructions would you want them to comply to? If you wanted them to generalize to the natural setting?
Sit at the table.
Sit at the table. What else?
Listen to me. Listen to what I have to say.
Has anybody ever heard all eyes on me? You know, they have a couple of key phrases. Sometimes we would observe things in the classroom and then go back and teach the kids the instructions. So you could pre-teach some of those things, or you could teach them right in the environment where you have to do them. So let's say it's circle time and the child doesn't know how to sit for circle time. The teacher might say, okay, everybody line up, and then you teach the child to line up right in that actual environment. You have some sort of a prompt procedure, you have some sort of a reinforcement procedure or repetition procedure right in that environment. So that would be an example of natural environment training. Actually, both of them are. The second example was more naturalistic than the first, but the both are trying to use those natural stimuli that occur in that environment for the training session. Teaching eye contact in the natural environment, you would have to look at me wouldn't be a natural environment training kind of thing. That would be something different. But if you were going to use natural environment training to teach eye contact, you would try to, like, for example, when do you make eye contact? A lot of times you make eye contact when you ask for something. So sometimes we do a procedure where we teach a child to ask for what they want, and then later we change the reinforcement schedule. So instead of getting the item when they ask for what they want, they also have to make eye contact when they ask for what they want in order to get the item. So that would be an example of natural environment teaching, because you're training the skill at the time when they're going to need it in the environment where they're going to need it. The thing that you described is actually less likely to promote generalization because you're doing it in a very weird, contrived way. So you're saying, look at me, look at me, look at me, and it's not usually the case that you're going to have to use the skill in that way. But if you said, look at me, at a time when you would normally need somebody to follow the instruction to look at me, so for example, when you're taking their picture, so you get the camera out and you go, look at me, and then they look at you. That's a normal time when they would need to look at you, so that would be more like natural environment training. Not that it's right or wrong, because there's different times when you would use each one of those. Again, we're just kind of understanding what they are, so that way you can pick what's the best time to use the best one at any given time.
What about using phrases like I can't hear you? Some kids who are higher functioning will look at you because they think they can't hear them.
Yeah, so something like that where you're using a natural phrase that somebody might say to them in order to prompt them to engage in a particular behavior, that would be kind of like natural environment training too, where you're using something directly from that environment. But I would be careful to make sure that those are the things, like usually when I'm doing things like that, where I'm setting up that situation to happen, I go and do an observation of the natural environment first. And then I take the cues from the people that are already trying to engage with the child. So I write down some of the phrases that the teacher's using or that the parent's using, and then I use the phrases that they're using to teach them those skills. So rather than just things that might happen, really programming something specifically that I saw happen so that they'll respond at the right time.